Good evening. On behalf of the Caxton Club, Chicago Art Deco Society, and the Union League Club of Chicago, we extend a warm welcome. In a time when distance is recommended, our clubs have come together to bring programming of mutual interest. Tonight's program, Modern in the Middle, fulfills the pledge. Given our mission, it's no surprise that the introduction to our program would be given by someone well known to each group. Chicago historian and a collector, a fellow Caxtonian, and a deco enthusiast. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Ed Hirshland, who will introduce our speakers and their topic. Ladies and gentlemen, Ed Hirshland.
Thanks, Jackie. Good evening, folks. This is an exciting event for me. The authors of tonight's book, Susan Benjamin, Michelangelo Sabatino, and Pauline Saliga, are all friends of mine of many years standing. I'm going to tell you a little about the authors and then a short introduction to their splendid new book, Modern in the Middle. First, a bit about Susan. As a little girl growing up in Minneapolis, she, in her own words, drew floor plans of my dream house, complete with an indoor pool, while my friends were making paper dolls, she says. She graduated from Brown University, having studied architectural history under William Jordy, and holds an MA in art history from the University of Minnesota. She's been at the forefront of Chicagoland historic preservation for over 50 years, starting in 1969 as a staff member of Chicago's Commission on Historical and Architectural Landmarks. Then she was a consultant for over 30 years, administering the Chicago Architecture Foundation's docent program and many other pursuits. In 2004, she founded Benjamin Historic Certifications in Highland Park. Her organization has written more nominations to the National Register of Historic Places than any other firm in Illinois. It's breathtaking. And if that weren't enough, she's contributed to and edited more magazines, journals, and guidebooks than you can count. And she's authored 3 magnificent books, among them Great Houses of Chicago. And of course, the book we're here to learn about today, Modern in the Middle. In her words, though I've written other books, this is the one I've always wanted to write. Since 1976, when I worked on an exhibition with Jim Nagel and Roland Lieber for the Illinois Arts Council on 30s and 50s architecture. So who's the other author? Michelangelo Sabatino is a distinguished professor at IIT's College of Architecture. A native of Canada, he went to college in Italy and graduated from UAV, spelled I-U-A-V, in Venice. That stands for Istituto Universitario di Architettura di Venezia, that he earned his PhD from the University of Toronto, easier for me to pronounce, and pursued a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard. Michelangelo joined IIT's College of Architecture in 2014, where he runs the PhD program. Michelangelo is the inaugural John Vinci Distinguished Research Fellow. For over 2 years, he was Dean of the College of Architecture, holding the Rowe Family Endowed Chair. Since I've had some close ties to the college for the last 14 years, I feel justified in making a personal observation. Michelangelo's tenure as Dean was transformative. Camaraderie among the faculty, students, and other stakeholders improved markedly during his deanship. Plus, enrollment, academic rankings, and finances all improved. I tip my hat to him for his outstanding accomplishments during a difficult transitional period. Books and publications, a ton. His 2011 Pride and Modesty, Modernist Architecture in the Vernacular Tradition in Italy, was recognized with multiple honors, including the Alice Davis Hitchcock Award from the Society of Architectural Historians. The latest is Modern in the Middle. The third contributor to the book is Pauline Saliga, who wrote the foreword. Pauline is the executive director of the Society of Architectural Historians. Pauline previously was at the Art Institute of Chicago, where she contributed essays to many catalogs and books, including The Sky's the Limit, The Century of Chicago Skyscrapers. Pauline is a fellow of the Society of Architectural Historians, a high honor from the organization. Let me mention a fourth author, Michelangelo's partner, Serge Ambrose, who contributed to a pivotal section on preservation. And now a little bit about the book itself. Susan is going to explain the title. For all the bibliophiles in the audience, I'd like to point out that in addition to its content, this is one beautiful object. The printing is rich and beautiful. The photographs are superb, with many examples from the likes of Hedrick Blessing, Harry Callahan, and Richard Nicol. The binding is superb and sturdy. The paper is splendid, and the cover. Please note that the title is, well, in the middle of the front cover, and it's also in the middle of the spine and in the middle of the title page. That's no coincidence. Modern in the middle. Bravo to the designer. One salient feature of the book is the inclusion of both famous and lesser known houses. Another strength, Susan and Michelangelo highlight the contributions of clients and current owners as opposed to just focusing on the architects. And significantly, they highlight both spouses and the names of the houses so as to give equal credit for the commission. To me, one of the most charming aspects of the book is that each author writes lovingly of his and her own house, respectively. These two entries alone are worth the price of admission. And now, take it away, Susan.
Hi, this is Susan Benjamin. It's a pleasure to be with you and talk about Modern in the Middle, the book that I co-authored with Michelangelo Sabatino. The great question is, where does Modern in the Middle come from? What an odd name. And it has many layers of meaning. One is that it covers a lot of territory, including houses throughout the Chicago area, from the north side, the Ganster House in Waukegan, by Ganster himself, the Dorothy and Paul Schweiker House in Schaumburg, which was then Roselle, and on the south side, the Heimbach House by Bertrand Goldberg. Middle of the country. Chicago is at the crossroads of America, with railroads crisscrossing the country and highways. So there is that. It also represents an architectural middle ground, with these two giants influenced practically every subsequent architect after 1936, when Frank Lloyd Wright developed his Usonian houses, and Mies van der Rohe when he came to Chicago in 1938. I'm very fond of these particular photographs that show Wright embedded in nature and Mies van der Rohe standing proud in front of the model in back of the model of Crown Hall. There are, in our book, houses by architects that are well-known, architects that are lesser known. Some are houses more that show a greater influence by Frank Lloyd Wright. They're organic and represent the horizontality of the prairie landscape that characterizes Chicago, like Phil Will's house with its broad overhangs, and the Miesian house designed by architect Roy Binkley. Roy was a graduate of IIT, and he was studying there when Mies van der Rohe was teaching. So that it is a very crisp, modern building with broad expanses of glass that overlook the surrounding landscape in Long Grove. And what I want to concentrate on to some extent today are the middle class clientele who commissioned these houses. This book is not about lifestyles of the rich and famous. One is the Ben Rose house, that Ben and Fran Rose. And I do want to mention that throughout the book, we give equal billing to the spouse, because so often the woman has a huge role to play. And in this case, Ben and Fran were partners. He had a showroom at the Merchandise Mart and designed these wonderful, whimsical fabrics. One of the houses that is featured in the book is the Rosalie and Gustav Weinfeld house, not a particularly well-known house, by James Eppenstein. Gustav was a pediatrician who lectured throughout the country. He taught at the University of Illinois and was an expert on infant development. His wife, Rosalie, who I happen to know because our kids went to the nursery school where she was the director for 42 years. So these were kind of typical progressive thinkers who were the clients of the distinguished architects we feature in the book. This particular house, 1936, has some sort of streamlined Art Deco features, as you can see at the back. Adlai and Ellen Stevenson. Well, Adlai, of course, was the governor of Illinois. He ran for president twice, in 1952 and 1956, and a consummate diplomat and statesman. He was a hero to me. I had the privilege and pleasure of writing the National Register nomination for his house in Libertyville, and he was a 35-year-old attorney when he built this house. It's rather a quiet, contemporary house. It was designed by Perkins Wheeler and Will, whose work I'm very familiar with because they designed our house. And you can see the prairie influences, the broad overhangs and the horizontality. But this was actually the second house. The first house they had designed, was not by Perkins Wheeler and Will. It was by Howard Fisher, who was head of General Houses, and they had him design a steel house with a flat roof and steel panels. They called it their mechanical house. This fireproof house, however, burned, and with it were lost a lot of his documents. A very sad story. But they rebuilt when they wanted a somewhat more traditional house, and Howard Fisher said, "I don't do that." They went to Perkins Wheeler and Will. As was Adlai's, I call him that because I feel like I really got to know him when I wrote the National Register nomination, and it is now a National Historic Landmark. It's been elevated to that, and it is currently the Center for Democracy. So I urge you to get on their mailing list and follow their program. So his habit would be to get dressed in the morning and, look at the streamlined look in this very sort of chic dressing room where he would get up in the morning. He might go downstairs, go for a walk to the Des Plaines River, and then go into his office where he would work. And a lot of the greats were attending parties and events, and picnics, democratic events. This is Bobby Kennedy. Nancy Stevenson was kind enough to share this with us. You can see the porch in the background. Eleanor Roosevelt was there. It was John F. Kennedy. I mean, it was home. It was the place where he entertained his family. He ran for president in 1952, 1956. Of course, was defeated by Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was a war hero, and then became governor of Illinois. But no matter where he traveled, and he was later ambassador to the UN, he always considered his farm, as he called it, in Libertyville, his home, with his beloved family and his dog Artie, whose tail you can see, and the farm around, which he loved very, very much. The Catherine and Lloyd Lewis house was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright was a friend of Catherine and Lloyd Lewis. It was a Usonian house. In 1936, Frank Lloyd Wright designed and built his first Usonian house in Madison, Wisconsin. It was affordable housing, and he wanted to develop, during his whole career, a house that was accessible to people. It blended into the landscape, using natural materials, wood, glass, Chicago common brick, and he blurred the relationship between the house and its surroundings. This is on the banks of the Des Plaines River, and not very far from Adlai's house. Very important man. They were both journalists. He wrote with Henry Justin Smith, Chicago, The History of Its Reputation, and he wrote award-winning books on General Sherman and on Abraham Lincoln. And this is the interior of the house with, again, a universal open space, intimate area for dining, and of course, the fireplace hearth that was the symbol of home and important to him. Very similar to the fireplace in the Schweiker house, and there's some thought that perhaps the carpenter from building the house for them actually visited Schweiker's own home. The Ellen and Lambert Ennis house, 1942. A lot of the houses in our book were published, but this is kind of an interesting story because, I've mentioned these are not lifestyles of the rich and famous. This Lambert Ennis was a professor at Northwestern. He built his house on what was Daniel Burnham's property in Evanston, facing the street, not located in a bucolic setting, but very trim and with a quiet presence on the street. And what was special about it was, and it was published, Professor's House features separate access. So the students could come into the house, meet with their professor, and not actually get into the family living area, which you can see right here is opens onto a garden. And you can see the influence of Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, William Decknatell, who designed this house, trained at Taliesin with Wes Peters. He was one of the first graduates in 1932 or one of the first attendees at Taliesin in Wisconsin. And there was a booklet that was published on Decknatell and Schweiker because there's a lot of similarity between their work. But you can see the broad overhangs, the chimney core, the pierced overhangs, and the openness to nature. The windows were very special. And the house, although it has, you can see the prairie influences, it also embodied some international style influences. And Decknatell had been to Europe, studied with Andre Loursat, and so these windows opened up into the gorgeous garden, and a unique kind of window that has no center mullion bar that opened the window 100%. And it was published early on in this booklet on windows in the modern house. Rachel and Ralph Helstein were also very, very important people. I can tell you a little personal about him because he was a fraternity brother of my father's. And so when I worked on the exhibit that I did in 1976, my dad arranged for an introduction, and I got to meet him and see this house. He grew up in Minneapolis, as I did, and it was a very anti-Semitic city. And he became a social activist throughout his whole life, especially advocating for African Americans. He marched with Dr. Martin Luther King. He went to visit King in New York, and he consulted with Ralph Helstein on policy. And I do want to quote this to you. In King's book, he dedicated it to my dear friend Ralph Helstein, for whom I have great respect and admiration, and whose support I cherish very deeply, signed Martin. And of course, this great progressive thinker and social activist who lived in Hyde Park, where the University of Chicago is a very progressive neighborhood, hired Bertrand Goldberg to design his house, which is basically 3 slabs and 8 cylindrical posts, leaving the interior to do as you wish. The cylindrical post morphed into two cylindrical buildings with the with Marina City. This is what was there before, and this is a typical kind of neighborhood apartment building that you'd find in Hyde Park. Very influenced by the domino houses developed by Le Corbusier, the house that could be expanded to a high-rise or horizontally into townhouses. And this is the back. You can see the cars arranged under the carport. I share the plan with you. Ground floor, enter on the ground floor, surrounded by glass, go upstairs. And the next level is a living room, dining room with a mezzanine that I'll show you. Living, dining, kitchen, open plan with 3 bedrooms at the back. And then on the 3rd floor, the master area. And I really want to note that Rachel Helstein was a very important person, and their daughter Nina, who I had the privilege of having lunch with, was telling me how important she was to this house. She herself was a graduate of the University of Chicago, president of the National Council of Jewish Women, and was invited to be an observer in 1945 when the United Nations was established. So she was as important in her own world as Ralph Helstein was in his. And to show you how the house functioned, you entered in at the ground level, go up the stairs into the 2-story living room with this skeleton. Basically, it could be built out however. Bertrand Goldberg designed this table that is in the photographs in the collection of the Art Institute. So he designed furniture for the building as well as the house itself for these really significant people. And you can see how the pierced concrete block mezzanine where the master area is, and this is a library sitting room overlooking Hyde Park. You can see the apartment building there. The very comfortable, wonderful, inviting open space, and said, "How's this for a home?" And I think it was really pretty terrific for a home. And finally, I want to end my presentation to you today with our home. My husband Wayne and Wayne was a founder of Chicago Architecture Foundation, so currently CAC. And so we share a common interest in architecture. We found this house that Larry Perkins designed in 1941. Sort of a transitional house. It's redwood with great expanses of corner windows overlooking nature, but kind of a traditional roof line. We love modern furniture, so you see the Mies van der Rohe chairs and what it looks like on the interior. And then in 1966, the house was added to by Ed Birch, who put a Florida room on it. And the furniture you see is a composite of furniture that belonged to my parents. I grew up in a 50s ranch house. My in-laws, who added to their house in the 50s. And so and turquoise was the favorite color. So we have this glass room with turquoise furniture, upholstered furniture overlooking our backyard. And the client was Ruth and Hilmer Svensson, and he was an ad guy, and he coined the term "say it with flowers." So that he was a client for our home, which we love, and it gives me great pleasure to share it with you today.
I'm thrilled to speak this evening in front of such a diverse and interesting audience. I wish to thank Jackie Vossler, Cheryl Zeigler, and Jeff Cruz for this three-way collaboration amongst the Caxton Club, Union League Club of Chicago, and the Chicago Art Deco Society. Thanks are also due for my friend Ed Hirschland for his kind introduction and ongoing support. With this evening's densely packed program, please consider this brief introduction to our book more of a stand-up buffet than a proper sit-down meal. You have already heard from Susan about the meanings associated with the middle in our book, titled Modern in the Middle, Chicago Houses 1929 to 75. Tonight, we focus on a handful of modern houses that were commissioned by middle and upper middle class professionals who identified with progressive values. Although the Robey and Farnsworth houses seen here were designed with different approaches to materials and site, together they established Chicago and surrounding cities and villages as a laboratory for innovation in residential architecture. Yet, as the contents of our book reveal, there are many more protagonists in this multifaceted and multi-generational Chicagoland story than a handful of iconic houses. The network of Chicagoland neighborhoods, cities, and villages discussed in our book are linked together by train and automobiles. Just as the designs of modern houses differed, so too did the social fabric of these distinct places. Whether it is Highland Park or to the north, or Riverside to the west, or Olympia Fields to the south, our book tackles a wide range of Chicagoland area. What they all share in common is the fact that architects and their adventurous clients introduced modern houses and communities where none were previously found. In many ways, the genesis of this book can be traced back to the 1976 Chicago Architects Exhibition and accompanying catalog by Stuart Cohen and Stanley Tigerman. Hosted in the lobby of the Time Life building designed by Harry Weiss, this exhibition served as a catalyst for questioning prevailing narratives about architectural traditions in this storied city. Chicago Architects was meant as a counter to the exhibition 100 Years of Architecture in Chicago, being held simultaneously at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, as at its then nearby location. So you see both the Museum of Contemporary Art and you see the Weiss building going up in this wonderful image. In the writing and research of Modern in the Middle, we understood that the circulation of a European-inspired modern architecture in Chicago was here well before the arrival in 1938 of Ludwig Mies van der Rohe that would go on to direct architecture at Armour, now IIT. And this was because of the important role played by George Fred Keck in the design, for example, of his House of Tomorrow and Crystal House of 1934, seen here to the right for the Century of Progress International Exposition. Modern Architecture International Exhibition number 15, held at the Museum of Modern Art in 32, that you see advertised here, went on display later the same year in the galleries of the Sears flagship store in Chicago's Loop. Many of those attending this evening from the Chicago Art Deco Society will recognize one of the first books discussed in our, one of the first houses discussed in our book, the monumental house built in 1932 for Colonel Robert Homer and Rosalie D. Brown Morse, since it was published in the wonderfully illustrated book, Art Deco Chicago, Designing Modern America, edited by Robert Brugman. The Morse House demonstrates how 20th century architects, in this case, Zimmerman, Sachs, and Zimmerman, absorbed cues from different yet complementary approaches ranging from classicism, Art Deco, and the international style. Despite its stately size of 24 rooms, the three-story flat-roofed house was designed as a second residence for the client and his family in the North Shore city of Lake Forest on the golf course grounds of the Knollwood Club, founded in 1924. To commission a house for leisure during the height of the Depression era and the dangerous Prohibition years speaks to the financial prowess of Colonel Morse. As a side note, I want to mention that thanks to the research provided by the Director of Archives and Library of the George N. Layton Library at the Union League of Chicago, that is our fabulous Cheryl Zeigler, we discovered that Morse, along with several others of the families presented in this book, were part of the club. Morse became general manager of Fairbanks Morse and Company in 31, a year before the completion of the new Lake Forest house. The house was also featured shortly after it was completed in an advert to the right for the Window Screens Roll Screen Company, later renamed Pella in Iowa. Here we see to the bottom the Morse house. The Francis J. and Sylvia Vala Benda house seen here was designed by architect Winston Elting, who was born in Winnetka, and he designed it for the Olmsted and Vox Design Village of Riverside in 1939. For the past 4 years, my partner and I, Serge Ambrose, and I have been working on the preservation and renovation of this house. We have a brief overview of the house in our book, in the author's part at the very end. Because of the quarter round glass block flanking the front entrance and a curvaceous handmade handrail in the entrance, the house is sometimes mistaken as Deco, even if its massing and siding are squarely modern. For fans of streamlined moderne, here we see the famous Zephyr of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad that passed through Riverside, and we see it on the right, on its inaugural voyage to the Century of Progress exposition, arriving in Chicago on May 26, 1934. To the right is the Riverside distinct water tower designed by William LeBaron Jenney for one of America's first railroad suburb designed as a park. Interiors of the Zephyr were done by Philadelphia-based architect Paul Cray, and here in Chicago, Holabird and Root. Now moving to the post-World War II years, we see the one-story Isabella Gardner and Robert Hall McCormick third house, one of the two single-family houses designed by Chicago area clients by Mies van der Rohe. Unlike the Dr. Edith Farnsworth house that I'm sure you all know well, completed a year earlier in 1951, that was elevated to accommodate flooding of the Fox River, the interlocking pavilions of the McCormick house lay gently on the ground of a suburban lot in the city of Elmhurst, with landscape by Alfred Caldwell as part of the overall scheme. The house was conceived as a prototype for affordable mass-produced modular homes, with the client Robert Hall McCormick III and Herbert S. Greenwald as co-developers. McCormick owned, in collaboration with developer Herbert Greenwald, the land on which the Mies designed 86880 Lakeshore Drive apartments were realized. Isabella Gardner, his spouse at the time, was a poet. and her during her term as associate editor for Poetry magazine, it coincided with her time in her new house, and she wrote her first two books, Birthdays from the Ocean and The Looking Glass, while living in the Mies designed house. This view of the living room shows that, in fact, they were book lovers, so to speak. And for our Caxton Club book lovers, here we see the covers of two collections of poetry published by Gardner during and immediately after her time in Elmhurst, here in the western suburbs of Chicago. There we see her sitting down with purse in hand. Textile designer Ben Rose and his wife, Frances Landrum, a weaver and his business partner, selected A. James Spire, Mies's first graduate student, to design their house in Highland Park. David Haid, another talented IUT grad, later designed on the same site the Auto Pavilion made famous in John Hughes's 1986 film, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. This is a photo to the right of the Ben Rose textiles and wallpapers showroom in the Merchandise Mart during the 1950s. IIT grad Clarence Krasinski designed an impressive house for Charles R. Cork Walgreen III, who was 33 years old at the time and named president of the Walgreen Company, founded by his grandfather, who had worked in a drugstore on Chicago's South Side, purchased it in 1901, and then set about expanding the company. Cork Walgreen knew the business well, having begun as a stock boy in 1952. After earning a degree in pharmacy from the University of Michigan in 1958, he worked his way up through the ranks. By 1975, 6 years after the house was completed, Walgreens had grown to more than 1,500 pharmacies in 633 stores. When Krasinski proposed a Z-shaped Mies-inspired Corten steel and glass house, he was immediately hired. The predominantly steel and glass Walgreen house closely follows the design aesthetic of Mies, a material palette most frequently associated with Chicago's modern skyscrapers, not single-family homes. Even though we have a post-1975 coda in our book, the selection of the modern houses in our book that I've shown you thus far ends with 1975 because of the changing attitudes in modern architecture prompted by the 1976 exhibition about Chicago architects mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. The Free Arc House seen here was designed for a relatively small lot in Riverside for Ruth Nelson, an artist, and Robert J. Free Arc, her husband, physician. When they moved to Loyola here in the western suburbs and needed a home closer by. This modern house was begun in 1971 by Lawrence Kenny and John Vinci and completed in 1975. Vinci stated, and I quote, "From that house, I learned that you don't have to follow Mies religiously," end quote. And in fact, in this house, Vinci draws from Mies the very simple buff-colored brick that's ubiquitous on the IIT campus, but also looks to Le Corbusier and others still to create a warm and friendly home that is still modernist in ethos. Vinci's house in Riverside is a good place to end. Here we see a photo of Serge to the right, hanging off the ladder next to me. He took the lead on the preservation renovation of the house, with me providing the historical research and occasionally some of the grunt labor. Although the process has required equal doses of perseverance, patience, and a bit of obsessive folly, it has proven a worthwhile endeavor, and we encourage others to take on similar challenges. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Pauline Saliga, and it's my pleasure to engage with these two authors of Modern in the Middle. And first off, I want to congratulate you both. It's a well-written book, it's a well-edited book, and it is beautiful, which is something that everyone people comment about all three of those things. So congratulations, it is a big success. Susan, I'd like to start with you. How did the idea for Modern in the Middle originate?
It originated a long time ago, in 1976, when Jim Nagel and Roland Lieber and I assembled an exhibition for the Illinois Arts Council. We had $1,200 to spend, and we designed the exhibition. We talked to Jack Hedrick and got photographs. And my job was to research, to pick a dozen buildings. And it was fascinating because some of the buildings that we selected, like the Helstein House, are buildings that Michelangelo and I wrote about in the book. And this was before the exhibit, Chicago Architects, 100 Years of Architecture. So we were kind of on the leading edge there for a while. And that turned me on. And I just wanted to learn more and do more and write a book.
Great.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, Michelangelo, what sparked your interest in working with Susan to develop this into a book?
Well, so basically when my partner and I, Serge, arrived here to Chicago and Riverside, we began to want to take on the preservation and renovation of our house, and by Winston Elting, a Chicago architect. And so what we began to see was that there wasn't a lot of resources. And we actually went to Lake Forest, where Winston Elting's house for himself was designed in the early 40s. And through that, the owner suggested that we contact Susan. And so after a fabulous walk around Crow Island School and several conversations afterwards, Susan and I decided that we would combine our strengths and collaborate.
Got it. So Susan's passion for it continued, and
Right.
and you caught that passion. But one thing that is of interest to me is that there's obviously a wealth of information on this topic. You know, there's an abundance of incredible modern houses in the Chicago area. Why do you think nobody ever really tackled this before as a book? That's for both of you.
Susan, go first.
Oh, yeah. Well, Pauline, you and I talked about this for years, didn't we?
We did.
We did. And I think a lot of it has to do with the difficulty of getting a book published today. And, you know, my dream was it should come together and be, you know, a scholarly underpinnings and a selection of significant buildings by lesser known or well-known architects. And it should be beautiful. And I'm proud to say I think that happened. But to put all that together, and you need money, you need a publisher that is on board with you. And it's really tough in this market, in this time, to put all the pieces together. And Michelangelo and I think we each brought different things to the table and made it happen.
Right. And I would add to that, I mean, I had the good fortune of, in terms of support, we had the foundation support from Wrightwood 659, Alpha Wood, I'm sorry, and also from my endowed chair when I was the interim dean. And so there was some financial assistance, but I mean, the response to you, Pauline, and you know, many historians that write books, it's a lot of work, and we're constantly juggling many things in our lives and teaching, at least academics, and so it really is sacrifice, and but I think you know, when you bring all of these loose threads together, you're also very much doing a service to the community. And one of my colleagues likened this as like throwing up all these confetti, and we were gathering the confetti and putting them into one container. And I really liked that image of doing the work. And also, I mean, what I think is very interesting is Susan has had many decades of experience working on the field. I was a newbie to Chicago, and so I had been working on other strains of modernism around the world. And so this was a great way of blending our expertise.
I would like to add one more thing, and I want to give a shout out to some other contributors who played a really major role in the way the book turned out. One is Nancy McCaslin, our editor, who was fantastic. One is Bud Rodeker, the designer, and one is Monticelli Press, Alan Rapp. It was a situation where all the pieces came together.
Right.
In a beautiful product in the end. Congratulations again. I know that there are so many really extraordinary modern houses in the Chicago area. I'm kind of wondering, what criteria did you use to choose the houses that would actually make it into the book? It must have been a difficult process.
It was.
Susan, you want to take that and I'll respond after?
Sure, that's fine. I think, first of all, we had access to Hedrick Blessing photographs at the Chicago History Museum. And they were really the messengers of modernism, to quote John Miller, who was president of Hedrick Blessing. So we had those images, plus Nathaniel Parks at the Art Institute provided access to what they had. So we went at it from a lot of different angles, from visuals and from research that we both had done. I'd done quite a lot over the years for my work, because I write National Register nominations and local landmark nominations, and I'd research some of these buildings. And how about you, Michelangelo? What would you add to that?
Well, my perspective was also from the IIT perspective, as at that point I was the interim dean and faculty. And so I was intrigued to see how graduates of IIT had transformed the sort of single family house, the iconic Farnsworth House, and see how many had built ones of their own. And many are featured in the book. Jack Brownson's house that actually he did as a master's thesis. It was a mini Crown Hall with out in Geneva, or Y.C. Wong, Chinese American architect who's known for his courtyard houses, but we unearthed one in a single family house in Olympia Fields. And then finally, for example, John Matusimi, who was one of the first post-World War to Black grads that came to IIT through the GI Bill, and who designed a very interesting house in Chatham. And so I was interested in the IIT connection, and conversely also, there's plenty of buildings that Susan wrote about that had the kind of Wrightian connection. So we thought, what better way of bringing together two giants in the room, to quote Susan's essay, than to sort of identify folks that were working in this area and looking to both, not just one or the other, but to both.
To follow up on that, Michelangelo, is there a particular building or modern landscape that you're just heartbroken you couldn't include in the book? Is there one that you couldn't get up off the cutting room floor? Right,
and this is, Pauline, this is going to make you happy, since you are an expert on Bruce Goff. So I can earnestly, and I'm not saying this to sort of make you feel good about your work on but there were so many interesting, we ended up including the Ford House, of course, out in Aurora, but there were so many interesting other houses. Absolutely. And I know also Susan, has some ones that she wanted to bring in. And it was also, the publisher was also already very generous. I think we're at 350 pages. and so, and even this format, which I actually quite like, where you have two essays, introductory essays, and then you have these like short stories where many people have told us, I'm not joking, more than one person said, I read one a night. So enough to read, to sort of be able to sit and read, but not have to, spend like hours over like an 8,000 word essay. And so even the format, like of these kind of shorter stories that kind of address various aspects of the houses. So we got 53. They could have probably gone up to 80, but at a certain point, or even more. But it's we hope. I earnestly hope that others will follow up and add to what we've started.
I would like to add something to that. That what I felt bad about is sometimes we just didn't have the images. And there were people like Tony Grunsfeld, who was really important, an important modernist, and did some really cool houses in the 50s. We just didn't have access to drawings or photographs. So actually, I took a photo at a house in Northfield that he designed, a beautiful house for a Chicago Bauhaus and Beyond party. And I cropped it and fooled around with it. And lo and behold, I could at least include him. And the same with Ed Humrick. He's a really, a righty, and as opposed to, Tony's, whose work was more influenced by Mies. But, we just didn't have the photographs, so we couldn't include them. And that was too bad.
Right. I mean, we could have, and we did in some instances, like we have a Humrick that's, Lieberman House in Flossmoor, but that was just in my introduction. So absolutely, Humrick, you could do an entire book on Humrick. And that is basically some of the challenges here, Pauline, is that as pioneering as Betty Bloom's, oral histories are, and I know you and Susan were also involved in oral histories, whether it's A. James Spire or others still. The problem is that, there's not been a significant amount of work. Like Brownson, there's so many architects, even Schweiker, who are distinguished, and yet, there should have been sort of monographic studies done on that.
And yet, Bruder is, excuse, I didn't mean to interrupt, but no. I don't want to forget, because Will Bruder is finishing this book on Schweiker.
Great.
So there will be one shortly.
Great.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, I have one last question because we want to leave time for the audience to ask questions as well. For both of you, what advice would you give to someone who wants to build on the incredible research you've already started? There are a lot of aspects of modern housing in Chicago that remain unwritten. And what would your advice be to someone who'd like to pick up where you have left off?
Well, Michelangelo, you want to tackle it and then I'll add on?
Sure. Spend some time perusing our bibliography. We were very painstaking about the bibliography, and and I was also going down that list, like people like Rabori, or when you look at that bibliography, I think we quoted or cited way too many times just Betty Bloom. So if you were to just add to Betty Bloom, kind of other layers, already the work that was done, even our friend John Zukowski early on, and you were involved as well in those small exhibitions that generated avant-garde in the suburbs. What was it? Schweiker and Decknatel. So I would say start with focusing on architects who are maybe even known, like in the case of Brownson, for the more institutional, bigger scale work, and then go flip through the magazines, whether it's Inland Architect or others, and just start identifying areas that sort of seem to merit more attention.
In all my walking around, because I live in Highland Park, and we live in a modern house of sorts, and what I think has not been tapped are houses by developers, or that there or not necessarily by architects whose names are familiar. Just walking around, I have literally tripped over houses that are really beautiful of the period, walking neighborhoods. And they're out there. And I think some survey work to see what's in the various suburbs, because that's where most of them are. South,
Mhm.
really the south suburbs, untapped. There's some
Yes.
really fabulous houses. Flossmoor, Olympia Fields,
Uh,
needs to be investigated.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. I think a survey, and I think Docomomo is doing one little by little of different suburban areas. I think Lisa DiChiara at Landmarks Illinois has talked about that. So that work is going on, and I think important research is going to come out of that work. First, you have to survey, and then you can add the layer of interpretation.
Mhm.
So thank you both. This was such a fun thing to do, to get together and talk with you about this wonderful book. And I think the audience is going to have some interesting questions for you as well. So thank you both very much.
Thank you, Pauline, for all the good work you do here in
Oh, yeah.
Chicago, nationally and internationally.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, yeah. We're very grateful and at many levels. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's nice to see you both.